Welcome again to Day 2 of 2021 Sports Society and Social Change Conference. I am Aaliyah Martinez, a fourth-year undergraduate student in social work at San Jose State University. I am a current intern with PRSSA and want to use my voice to uplift marginalized communities with an emphasis on the LGBTQ+ community. I have the pleasure of introducing your moderator for the enlightening keynote panel, Media and Mental Health, Dr. Shaun Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher is an assistant professor of public relations and sport communication at San Jose State University in the School of Journalism and Mass Communications. He also serves on the advisory board for the Institute for the Study of Sport, Society, and Social Change at SJSU, as well as the board chair member on diversity and inclusion for the Public Relations Society of America, Silicon Valley. Earning his doctorate in intercultural communication from Howard University, Dr. Fletcher also established a professional development consultancy where he works to train and develop current and aspiring leaders for culturally competent and gratifying service. Thank you, Dr. Fletcher.
Aaliyah, thank you so much, and fantastic work for yourself, but all of your student peers. Good morning, good afternoon to some, and who are we kidding? I'll say good evening to others, because we have an international footprint here, really due to the extraordinary work of Dr. Carter Francique and the entire team at the Institute. Again, I am Dr. Shaun Fletcher. I will be point guarding and guiding this conversation today with an illustrious panel that we're going to spend a bit of time talking about the media and mental health. And before I do, I fully want to acknowledge the delicate nature of this topic. And while it's delicate, it's more so important for us to talk about it from the various vantage points that we're going to talk about it today. But I would be remiss if I did not ask and request that we move through this, both audience and panelists, with self-care in mind. Fair enough? So we're going to talk for a little while, and then we're going to open it up for audience Q&A. So as we're talking, and as you start to learn a little bit more about each of our panelists through their conversation and some of the things that they've experienced, and if it strikes a chord with you, if it resonates with you, jot down a question, and we will open it up for Q&A as we move through. However, before we get too far into it, let me bring in our panelists. First off, we have Dr. Stephany Coakley. Dr. Coakley is the Senior Associate Athletic Director for Mental Health, Wellness, and Performance at Temple University. Welcome, Dr. Coakley. Are you here?
I'm here.
Fantastic. Welcome. Next, we have Anna Johannes, who is a Paralympic swimmer and medalist for Team USA. She also does a tremendous amount of work that we'll learn a little bit more about later for the IPC, which is the International Paralympic Committee. Anna, welcome. Also, we have one of our San Jose State sons, Mark Spears, joining us, who does a tremendous amount of work for our campus, but also is a fellow board member of mine on the Sport Institute. And he is also a senior NBA writer, amongst a number of other titles that is very difficult for me to cite in the amount of time we have. Mark, good to see you. Welcome.
What's up, man? Your hair still looks good.
I appreciate it. Just a little bit more, right? And rounding out our panel is the Director of Journalism in Sports, Culture, and Social Justice at Morehouse College, Ron Thomas. Welcome, Ron. Good to have you.
It's really good for me to be back. I used to cover some San Jose sports, so I'm glad to be back here.
Fantastic. Hopefully we were winning when you covered us. That'd be fantastic. So let's dive in. And again, I'll remind you, the audience, as we're talking through this, be thinking of questions. Feel free to start chatting them into the Q&A box, and we will get to them when we reach that time. So let's zoom out a bit, panelists. And this is a question for everyone, starting with Dr. Coakley. So let's begin at a high level. Let's kind of start with a state of the state. from your vantage points, and we have such a diverse group of perspectives and industries represented both academically, collegiately, practitioner-wise, but also from an international Olympic vantage point as well. Where are we? Where are we in moving mental wellness forward within sport? What are you seeing, Dr. Coakley? Have we evolved? Are we prioritizing it? Do we have more positions like yours, which we're going to talk about a little bit more? Where are we, Dr. Coakley?
I think that, well, first of all, thank you, everybody, for just giving this very important topic of mental health this platform. This is something I'm super passionate about. It's what my purpose in life is to like spread the wellness message. And so for a long time, my career, it hasn't been something that has been very widely discussed. But across my career, I have seen quite a bit of change, even like graduating in 2006, when there were very few positions like the one I hold, and I mean like less than 10 in the whole country at a collegiate level. There has been a significant change in terms of the conversation, resources allocated to mental health and wellness. However, with that, I would have to say that there's stigma still exists. There's still a lot of stigma. Even though we're having these conversations, people still say things, but like, yeah, but. And so we still have to have strong conversations about there's no but. The mind controls the body. And in sport, if you think about it, the bodies have been prioritized. The bodies are the thing that is prioritized. We train, we coach bodies, we coach skills. But if you really pay attention, like you don't get to participate and train and compete without your mind. And you can use your mind to help, or it can be harmful to your performance. But we just started talking about that in the last, I'll say, 20. And even when we started talking about it, there weren't many people talking about it. So we have changed. Stigma still exists. So work still has to be done in this space.
Thank you, Dr. Coakley. Anna, what have you seen?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And again, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. When I was reading through everyone's bios, I was like, oh my gosh, how am I here? So I'm super excited to be here. Yeah, I think, especially in the past 6 months, I think the conversation has started with Naomi just blasting the door open and Simone just really putting a solid footing on athletes have brains, right? I think I was a Paralympic athlete, and we're not really told we're smart or really necessarily matter outside of our body, to your point, Dr. Coakley. And that can have a significant impact on what we think of ourselves and how we handle life around us. And I think when especially Simone, oh gosh, someone's about to walk into my room. Okay. One moment, sorry. I am in a hotel.
No worries, we're live. No worries.
Towel o'clock. I so apologize. But yeah, and so I think with Simone, it really changed the minds of athletes, right? I think I felt myself when she was talking for her own mental health and advocating for herself. I was like, you push through, girl. What are you talking, And then I was like, my fiance and I are both Paralympians, and we're like, actually, that's probably not a good mindset to have. So I think the fact that she empowered athletes, her and Naomi and Gwen and so many others now are having this conversation. It's not just changing the perception of the general public, coaches, but the athletes themselves. We feel it's a different world now, especially in the pandemic. Everyone's been focusing on mental health. And then now athletes are like, oh, that means me too. So yeah, I think it has changed, like you said, very long way to go, but it's definitely, there's a shift.
Thank you, Anna. Mark, coming over to you. What have you seen? Have we arrived? Are we evolving? Is it a slow pace? What are you saying? And you're on mute.
My space is more of the NBA space. This is entering my 23rd season of covering it, and Ron, being around the NBA, he gets it too. But first, also, Ms. Akila and, yourself, Dr. Shaun, man, thank you for everything you guys do for San Jose State. You guys do amazing work. So please continue all the amazing that you do. But, in the early 2000s, it just seemed like a lot of NBA teams did not have a psychologist and did not have somebody from mental health. I remember there was a guy that was with the Denver Nuggets and the Celtics, and they called him the mind doctor. And it was this guy who was just kind of around. The Warriors had a guy, I remember like 10, 12 years ago, who kind of like, you only saw him behind the scenes. And so a lot of times, most NBA teams for a while didn't have anyone, but I think over the last 5, 6, 7 years, you have more and more people that have had that opportunity. It's been good to see actually a lot of Black women, get that opportunity to work with NBA teams. And so some teams were ahead of the curve, had people before others did. Now I think every team has somebody. Some is full time. Some is, well, we can access this person, or we have them go by. And it's really hard to tell because, understandably, the NBA teams keep this private in a lot of ways, but I think it's probably imperative for, all NBA teams, all professional sports teams, all colleges, Division I, what have you, to have somebody that the players, the athletes can talk to. And like, I remember somebody that was a friend of mine who was in that role for the Thunder. She said she was not only available to the players, but also to the staff, to the coaches, and would help, in basically the entire organization privately with things that they were all going through.
I appreciate that. And we're going to unpack that practitioner's role a little bit more with Dr. Coakley later. But Ron, you bring a unique mix of practitioner, also academic. You have a unique vantage point. What are you saying? Are we evolving? Are we moving in the right direction?
Oh, I think definitely. I preceded Mark, as particularly working in the Bay Area. I came to San Francisco in 1978 and started covering college ball, and then the Warriors, 49ers, et cetera, for the San Francisco Chronicle and the Examiner. So, back then in the late 70s, early 80s, one of the, I think probably the first sports psychologist I ever met was Dr. Thomas Tutko from San Jose State. And he was a real revolutionary in this field. But he was just about the only one I heard of, who would work with a player and sort of look at, all of a sudden the reliever has lost his control of the plate. And maybe it's not a shoulder problem. Maybe it's a something in his mind or something psychological. And those are the types of things that Dr. Tutko would address. He also would address, just the everyday family stresses that can affect an athlete's performance. And I had not heard anybody talk about that before. And so now I think that's much more common to have somebody like that working with athletes. I think another aspect of this, which is a little off topic, but still relates to the same type of development, is I remember in the 1980s when the Sixers first won the NBA championship with Julius Erving and Moses Malone, they had a guy who was a special physical trainer. I forgot his name now, but that was really unusual back then. And now, of course, everybody has trainers, and individual players have trainers, and teams have elaborate, workout routines. But again, the sophistication that we see now is much greater than back then. But I still think money is a problem, because I think, particularly with fans and social media people, they look at particularly professional athletes as making so much money that they think they make so much money, you can't complain about anything, and it's unfair. I mean, just because somebody's rich doesn't mean they have a healthy marriage, doesn't mean they're not having stresses with their children, doesn't mean they're just going through their own stuff that's making it difficult for them to perform. And so I think there needs to be even greater acknowledgement by the public, and maybe by journalists, that underneath the uniform is a human being who is affected by all the types of things that affect us. And that needs to be taken into consideration.
Ron, I'm gonna, as a follow-up, I'm gonna stay with you, and then we'll jump back to Mark on this, and Anna as well as Dr. Coakley. You touched on a little bit of it in your response, but we talk about generational differences in sport and in general. But from your vantage point, each of you, are athletes today dealing with a unique set of mental health challenges than their predecessor?
You know, I talked to a real good friend of Mark Spears yesterday, Gary Washburn. He's covered the Boston Celtics for 12 years with the Globe, about 28 years of NBA coverage altogether, on and off. And I called him because I haven't been a full, regular reporter since 2003. So I wanted to ask him, okay, what's happened in that 20-year gap? And the main thing that's happened is social media. He was saying that, when I was covering up until like 2003, players got hassled, on the court while you were playing. There were the boo birds in the stands, and once in a while you might be at a restaurant and some fan will come up to you and say something insulting or something like that. But it was rare because, people didn't have that type of that way to get to you personally. But now with social media, particularly with younger players who are really into social media, you can insult a player anytime you want, just by connecting with them through social media, and they don't know who you are, but still you can say something very, very hurtful to them. And some players are very, very sensitive to that type of that type of comments they get. And also, I think there's been a blurring of the lines of what is a journalist. There are trained journalists, and there are athletes who are analysts, but they're not trained journalists. And then there are podcasters, and who knows what their feeling of expertise comes from. Mm-hmm. So all of these people can speak about and be given credibility about athletics. And some athletes really respond to them, to those comments when they're negative or harsh or insensitive. So all of that has changed just in the last 20 years to me.
Mm-hmm. Ron, you brought up so many different questions. We're going to touch on each of those throughout our time together. You're previewing everything we're going to talk about. I appreciate that. Mark, what have you?
Well, I think my generation and before, and Black men, we always were this like, don't, you're supposed to keep it in. Mm-hmm. You're not supposed to talk about it, man. You got to be tough. Mm-hmm. You can't show feelings. You can't show weakness. That's kind of how we were raised. And, I think that probably was a mistake for a lot of us in terms of holding everything in and not releasing it. And, I always noticed, interestingly, in covering the NBA, that the players seem to respond most to like female reporters, NBA players, Black women in particularly. I'm like, man, y'all tell them everything. But it was like they were talking to their aunt, their mom, their sister, instead of talking to some dude named Mark, right? And that they could confide in these women in a way that they perhaps didn't feel comfortable confiding in men because of the machoism of being a Black male, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, to Ron's point, and I guess should I mention social media or should I hold tight on that?
Go for it.
Yeah. I'm one of those people, man. I have a pretty substantial following, I guess. I have 550,000 followers on Twitter. Mm-hmm. Instagram, I'm okay. But, I learned long ago that they got people that are trolls, that they find pleasure in just trying to get your attention, to try to get your goat, to try to just say something bad about you. And oftentimes when I would respond to them, they're like, oh man, I'm really a fan of yours. I just want to try to get your attention, man. I ain't got no ill will. So from the beginning, early on, and I learned this, and Ron knows this from being a writer when Twitter started, like, I don't read the comments, man. Good or bad, I don't really read the comments. And then we get all worked up or what some dude in Des Moines with 500 followers thinks. Like, come on, like, why do we care so much about somebody that's not even, in our industry, or somebody that's just running their mouth says. Sadly, I think so many athletes and just people in general, and I, had this conversation with Jamel early on, because she will go at people. I'm like, Why do you care so much about what they have to say? Why do you give them so much power? And there are people that get so much stress over what somebody who is oftentimes trying to just mess with them says about what they did. In terms of the media, they call it ESPN for a reason. It's the Entertainment Sports Network. Our job is to evaluate players, evaluate their performance. And, oftentimes, I guess maybe when it gets personal, when it crosses the line, yeah, I can understand there being a problem with it. But you have a bad game, you have a bad game. And it's tough, because these kids, this generation, they grew up with this phone. They live by what, everybody thinks, praise, good and bad. The only time it's really got scary to me, and I'll be honest, I got death threats once. And I mean, death threats are scary no matter what. But the scariest thing about social media is you don't know where it's coming from. So it kind of can freak you out, because I'm like, is it that person that's outside the game that's looking at me crazy? Like, how do I know in the internet universe who is really that mad at me? And we had to get the FBI involved, and it was over because I said, if Andrew Wiggins had been raised in the United States, I think he would have been a better basketball player, or a tougher basketball player. And the country of Canada hated me for it. And, I probably shouldn't have said that. And, but I don't need to die over that. Right. But in the regular terms, I just wish athletes, people, humans, don't give these folks so much power, man. Like on Instagram, you could mute people that are not following you, so you don't have to hear them. On Twitter, when somebody says something crazy, racist, mean-spirited, blah, 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 I just block them and move on. But unfortunately, people get caught up in that dark, ugly world where not only do they look for the acceptance of people they don't know, but they get pain from people they don't know as well.
Mark, and before I go to Anna, Mark, I want to peel a little bit further back on that in terms of generational approaches to this. You've been in the game for a while, covering the NBA. You've written a book, congratulations, with Spencer Haywood. You've been around for a while to see the different generational approaches to a lot of issues, social justice, but also mental health. We hear from DeMar DeRozan. We hear from Kevin Love. We hear from a number of folks who speak out around mental health. Have you seen a difference in terms of some of the elder statesmen in the NBA, in terms of how they approach it? Are they still giving that macho, suck it up type of approach?
Kudos to Kevin Love and DeRozan, because I think their strength has made it easier for others, and so I love both of those guys. I mean, DeRozan grew up in Compton. I can only imagine what he saw growing up. But on the flip side, Kevin Love grew up with money. So that's to your earlier point. Just because you grew up rich doesn't mean that you don't have issues, have something that you need help on. It's hard to tell for the older generation. But as I said earlier, like that lady that worked for the Thunder, she was available to everybody. So I think the good thing about not knowing that answer is that it's private, and probably Dr. Coakley could, respects that. Like, I know a lot about what's going on in the NBA, but they've done a good job of respecting the players, team personnel, in terms of, who they're talking to, who works for the teams. And I've been wanting to write that story because I know there's a lot of Black, especially Black women in that space. But I don't really think teams want to make those people available for us in respect to the players, and I understand that.
Yeah. Yeah, understood, and I'm eager to hear Dr. Coakley's response as well. But from my vantage point, it just seems that there's a different response from the older generation, specifically within the NBA, but across the many different professional leagues, a different response and almost comfort level.
Hey, Shaun, real quick, I forgot to mention the NBA has done an amazing job of, and give Chris Paul credit for this, and the player that they have much better insurance now, the retired players, than they did before. So now, if you play 10 years, you get an insurance not only for yourself, but your family and your spouse. So I do think there's an ability not only for physical aid from medical insurance, but mental aid as well, thanks to the NBA and the Retired Players Association.
Absolutely, which speaks to the support mechanisms that help facilitate what we're talking about. Anna, from your vantage point, what have you seen? Are there generational differences in how we approach mental health?
Yeah, I think so. I think these points are so valid, and like I was saying earlier, we were just kind of told to not talk about things, right? I remember going to the games and I'm like, don't bring anything up personally. You talk about how amazing, Team USA is and how lucky you're going to be here, right? But now we get to talk about our identities. I'm a disabled pansexual woman immigrant, and I can talk on panels like this about disability inclusion, the intersex of racism and ableism and homophobia, and have these conversations that even 8-10 years ago, it was, you say your company line and you get off the field or off the pool or whatever it is, you always had to be positive. And I think we're in a culture that's true for everyone, not just athletes. When someone asks you like, hey, how you doing? You always say, hey, I'm good, and then move on, right? And so when you're an athlete and you're under this microscope, it's just all the things that everyone experiences is put up to an 11. Right? We have imposter syndrome, body dysmorphia, depression, anxiety, ADHD, things like that aren't talked about or addressed, like you were saying, Ron, about having a mental health professional. We would have some on some teams, but it would be like, how do you get in the right headspace to swim faster? It's not like your mom was just diagnosed with cancer and now you have to go swim your fastest. Let's talk about that and embrace that and talk about you as a person before you enter the pool. And especially once you're retired, that's gone, especially for disabled athletes. Those resources are not there. And so there's just so much inequity within the sports world. So, but on a more positive note, there is a generational difference. I think Instagram and things like that absolutely contribute to the negative self-talk. Like you were saying, Mark, having people taking everything like they're talking to you personally because you're an athlete. When you get feedback, you have to internalize that. You have to make that about you and change something about you. So you have that mindset, and then you read someone's comment that you should cover up your disability. It's making someone uncomfortable. And you see that on social media and you're like, oh, it's very hard to kind of get out of that mental space, but you're 100% right. And that needs to be talked about. I will say, and I'll wrap this up, with things like TikTok, and this is going to sound so silly, but there's some really empowering conversations on that. I mean, obviously there's really bad racism and ableism and homophobia and stuff like that, but there are people sharing their stories and being able to hear from another disabled woman that, she got, really weird looks in a hotel when she was just trying to check in and they carried her bag without her permission, or different things like that. You're like, okay, this is happening. I am not siloed, right? I can talk about this. So there's definitely a generational difference. There's so much work to be done, especially when it comes to social media, because athletes have this tool there. And tool, good or bad. And so, yeah, I think there is that generational difference. And I think Gen Z is not going to put up with the bullshit as much as other generations. But Dr. Coakley, I'm very interested to hear what you have to say too.
Thank you, Anna. Dr. Coakley, again, you have and we're going to unpack your role a little bit more later on, but with respect to generational differences, the unique set of mental health challenges that this generation, current generation, and recent generations have dealt with, you have a unique vantage point. What do you see?
I I absolutely believe that this generation has a different way of handling mental health challenges. They are more inclined to talk about things, put it on social. So if you put it on social, then you just said it. And so other people are reading that, consuming your social media content. So this generation, I think a couple of things have contributed toward their ease, if you will. And one of them, it has to do with the media and the press. So there have been, in let's say the last 10 to 12 years, some pretty dark stories about people who suffered in silence. Mm-hmm. And so those outcomes were not what we want. And so these young people are growing up reading these stories and hearing there's got to be another way. We have to address these things when they happen. So I'm sorry, before they happen, so that they don't happen. We have to address, depression and anxiety when we see it at 11, 12, and 13 before it's big A anxiety and big D depression at 18, 19, 20, 21. When collegiate sport, which is a business, let's be real, when the pressures of performing at that level take over, so it turns into a more severe illness. So these students have grown up seeing some outcomes that they're trying to avoid. Not only the students, the coaches, the administrators, the parents, like everybody's trying to avoid these negative outcomes. So that would be one thing that separates this generation from past generations where we just heard, suck it up, drive on. You don't have any problems. What are you complaining about? You're here. Just do this. And I love, Anna, what you said about your identities, because when people suppress any aspect of who they are, that is a risk factor for depression, anxiety, like any of the things, disordered eating, substance abuse. So this ability for people to truly speak their truth and be honest about what's happening. Sometimes, like I hear people in our generation saying, like, I don't want to hear it, but it's important that people have space and place to speak their truth, to talk about what it is that matters to them. The other thing I'd also like to mention is that for certain generations of athletes, this is not that new. So we talked about the NBA, right? That's a team sport. But for individual sport athletes, they've been working on mental performance, but also mental health related, because you can't really separate the two, if I'm being honest. So individual sport athletes, tennis and golf, they've been doing this for way longer than your basketballs, your baseballs, your hockeys, and your footballs. And so that's kind of one of those, it's not just generational, but it's also like in the sport culture, a group that has been more open to discussing anything mental, and how it either affects performance on or off the field of play. So I just wanted to point that out as well. And, certainly there are cultural differences between groups. Some cultures are more inclined. Communities of color have been less inclined to go straight to a mental health provider. They will go to more, anybody else before going to, because, there's the stigma and the taboo. It's your sign of weakness, like something's wrong with you. Actually, I like to promote something's right with you. If you're going to address what is happening with you and for you, that means that's a sign of strength. Something is right with you. And we would not walk around with a broken arm, leg, shoulder, like we are. So we need to change that narrative. Mental health is health, period. Actually, at Temple this month, we are kind of celebrating Mental Health Awareness Month. And all the student athletes received T-shirts that said mental health is health, period. I think we lose the power to address this problem accurately when we separate the two. I mean, it's the whole body, right? It's all connected. So if we just say depression is a health condition, just like asthma is a health condition, we treat it the same as we treat asthma.
Thank you for that. You touched on so many different areas that hopefully we'll be able to do justice to throughout the remainder of our time. So now that we've established a bit of a foundation and we've heard from each of you, we're going to kind of do some targeted questions, and then we'll come back to the entire group. And of course, as I'm calling on individuals, feel free. If you got something burning you want to contribute to it, feel free, of course. All right. But Mark and Dr. Coakley in particular, from your vantage points, let's talk about some timely issues. We're still in a pandemic. We are, while it appears on a mass media front that the social justice movements that have spread throughout many of our professional leagues seem to be simmering a bit, which I don't believe. So I think we just shifted narratives and focus. From your vantage point, and Mark, I'll start with you, because you may even be able to speak from a personal mental health standpoint. You spent significant time in the NBA bubble in 2020. You were around the players. Many of the stories that emerged that you saw firsthand. How has the ongoing pandemic, as well as the various social justice movements, impacted the mental health well-being of our athletes? Mark.
That's a really good question, because it's just the 1 year anniversary of me leaving the bubble just came by, and I was there for 90 days. I'm actually give San Jose State a shout out. I actually minored in psychology, so I'm not saying I'm Dr. Coakley or nothing like that, but I still use some of the principles that I learned at San Jose State. And so when I came there, you know, I made sure I had things that made me happy. And don't judge me, Doc, either one of you docs, but I had a wine fridge and it was stocked. I had a toaster oven because I wanted my food a certain temperature. I made coffee every morning. I grinded my own beans. I got my iPad, so I was watching the Channel 2 news every morning so I could stay close to home. And I asked them to give me a bicycle. And I was the only media person that had their own bicycle. And also picked up fishing. Like, they let us go fishing once a week. So I made a point to do things that made it feel like I wasn't trapped, like made things that made me feel happy. Even though I was in a room for 90 days, I had so many things that inside the room and outside the room that made me feel happy that I was good. But I saw players breaking down. There was one media member in particular, who I'll not name, that also was in the bubble 90 plus days. And after the Lakers didn't go up 3-0 on Miami, he went into the corner of the gym and looked like he was about to cry because he wanted to go home. And he knew that it was going to be an extra couple days. And I had to we had to get him together. Dude, you're here for a job, man. But I understood his pain. So I've been hearing more and more about players that were mentally struggling there. And we used to kind of jeer at them a little bit because they were staying in 5-star hotels and they could have their family members and their girlfriends and their wives and their children come in. I couldn't have anybody. So, and they got much better food than we got, but they also were younger than us. And, I know a lot of players were really having a hard time, but the beautiful thing about the bubble that I also remember is the social justice movement. It almost brought me to tears to come on a court, first game. And I remember still, I think it was Pelicans versus the Jazz, I think. And you see Black Lives Matter on the court. To see white players wear jerseys on the back that said ally and Black Lives Matter on the back. To see all the players have different messages. To hear them talk about Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and to talk about that on a daily basis. And my fear or my worry about the bubble was that once the bubble burst and everybody left, that wouldn't transfer forward. And I do think the social justice movement has transferred forward, but I don't think it's with the same passion as, it was in the bubble. Yeah. They took away the jerseys, those beautiful jerseys. I wish the players could still wear them if they wanted to, Black Lives Matter hasn't been on the court now for a second straight season. Players are still talking, but it's not with the same strength and the same power. So my hope is that the ones that the guys that were really vocal are still the same, but I hope that fire that they had in the bubble not only gets hot again, because this isn't ending, but that they keep that passion for the rest of their lifetime, because that passion, I think, is inspiring not only NBA fans, but it's inspiring the world.
Man, I appreciate you
and
sharing
educating.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you sharing your personal experience down there as well. I heard a little bit about it, but I appreciate you unpacking it. Dr. Coakley, your thoughts on that, on the ongoing pandemic and social justice movements and the impact that that's had mentally.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mark, well done on the creating space that makes you feel joyful, that makes you feel happy, that is comfortable for you, not just comfortable for you. So kudos. So psych courses really worked to you. But I want to say that the pandemic was the great equalizer, not just in this country, but like globally. We were all affected by it. And here's what the pandemic presented. It presented uncertainty. It presented danger. It presented isolation. It presented trauma. None of those things are great words. And so when we think about the mental health of athletes, they were presented with all of that. And none of us really knew how to deal with it. So it wasn't like you could go somewhere and get some advice from anyone. We were all trying to figure it out. So the mental health of athletes definitely suffered because of those things, but not unlike the rest of us. What was also particularly stressful, because all of that is stressful, what was also particularly stressful was the constant testing. The constant testing and the panic or fear that athletes, reported because they weren't sure whether or not. So it was like that time between testing and then the results, that right there. That was a huge stressor for people. And when all those things combined hit, and for some people, it just overwhelmed their ability to cope. Mm. And so for Mark, he had his things that he enjoyed, but for some people, they didn't have anything. And so they went inside probably to their thoughts. They're worried, worrying about their families, worrying about their kids, worrying about getting sick, worrying about their financial, situation. So the pandemic was the equalizer for all of us, and athletes are no different. Nobody's immune to having a mental health condition. And so I think the NBA did a great job of having people in the bubble. One of my colleagues was in the bubble. Dr. Parham and some of his group, they were there providing services to WNBA and NBA players as needed. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that there were some people who were just, I'm a big, let's do what needs to be done just in case I need it. So proactive person. So I'm sure that there were some people having sessions every week for that 90 days or however long they were in the bubble, because that was absolutely imperative. Even, as a provider for student athletes at a university, nothing changed, just transferred to virtual. And I can tell you, but for some of my athletes, because their sport had been taken away. So for some of them, that was a stressor because of identity. And if I don't have my sport, then what am I? Who am I? What is this all about? School was just not enough. But for others of them, which I know, sport is a stressor for us. Competition is a stressor. Training is a stressor. Injury is a stressor. When that went away, their wellness improved. So I had the whole spectrum. Some student athletes who they had more distress. Some student athletes, their wellness improved, especially when you could leave campus and go home and be with your family. and knowing that isolation was going to adversely affect somebody's wellness. So it was different for the student athletes than it was for the pros in the bubble. But I'm glad to hear that NBA had those services. I want to take advantage of them. I hope folks were taking advantage of them.
Yeah,
Dr. Coakley, you appreciate this too. And I just thought about it. We had an app that every morning they would make us fill out. And it was questions. And it wasn't just questions about, we had to get our temperature, we had to get tested every day and all that. But there were mental health questions as well. Yeah. Which the app was private. It wasn't like we were standing in front of a group and answering these questions. And so I think that if you were struggling mentally, there was a space within that app every day, because they made us answer it every day, to say that I needed help, which I thought was great by the NBA. And she mentioned Dr. Parham, like, I never saw him, which is probably a good thing, because that means that he was busy and available to the players. But they from medical, only time I saw the doctor, I had a bad bug bite. That was pretty bad. But they made it known that there was mental health available in the bubble.
I appreciate that perspective. I'm going to call a bit of an audible. That question was for Mark and Dr. Coakley, but I want to bring in Anna and Ron if they're game to kind of speak about it from their vantage point, even zoomed out a bit. We all have been exposed to various vantage points in terms of how the ongoing pandemic, which again is ongoing, as well as the social justice movements have impacted athletes from a macro level, but also a micro level. Of course, Stephany and Mark, you can speak from a micro level, but even from a macro perspective, and Anna, I'll bring you in. Again, you're still exposed to, especially with the IPC and even from a governing standpoint of how different organizations have dealt with supporting their athletes, even from an organizational perspective. What have you seen? What are your thoughts in terms of how the ongoing pandemic and social justice, social athlete activism has impacted athletes' mental well-being?
It's a really good question, and I can kind of get into the pandemic and then social justice. Yeah. I think for the pandemic, it just exposed so much in the sense of athletes aren't really told to think that much, right? And so then you're sent home, you don't have the sport you love, your identity has been just shaken up completely as an athlete. And as a retired athlete, after I retired, I struggled very much with mental health. I was close to committing suicide twice, and that's why I'm here talking about mental health. And, when the pandemic hit, after, the initial shock, I was worried about myself, and I was lucky to have a good support system, but it's so hard. You never know what's going to trigger and things like that. So I think as far as an athlete side for that, as retired athletes, I think, especially because the games were coming up, the games were delayed and things like that. So the conversation was constantly happening. And then they were talking about, the NFL, NHL, things like that. And they also had to just, like, everyone was locked down. And so you just sat with thoughts that you usually don't think with. And I think from like a USOPC and an IPC view, when it comes from I'm so happy that the NBA had those conversations happening. From the athletes that I work with now, there never was an email like, hey, it wasn't like, it was like, hey, how's your training going? Do you have the right, do you have the right weights to weight lift, or, things like that? It's not like, are you taking care of yourself mentally? How is your family doing? Are you okay? Do you have a support system? And so there wasn't those conversations. But I think they are absolutely learning from it, again, with the incredible Black women athletes leading the way about mental health. And so when it comes to the social justice conversation, I think athletes are very siloed in the way that we think, right? I'm a swimmer, I'm a white swimmer, right? And that was my bubble. And the social justice movement for so many just blew the conversation up, right? Like, we knew racism existed, but I mean, I'm speaking from the perspective of a white athlete. And so, and I've heard it from teammates, right? And so this happened and I was like, oh my gosh, I wasn't listening. I wasn't listening to my teammates. I wasn't being a good teammate. Swimmers are inherently, literally in your lane, right? And you don't really kind of think outside of it. So with the social justice movement, it gave voice to the voiceless. It brought in so much more diversity and just conversation within sports. So the team became more holistic. You were having better conversations. And as far as mental health, I mean, I think, again, the intersectionality of the conversation, right? It kind of started in one place and then everyone started educating themselves more, right? Disability in our community, there's thousands and thousands of different types of disabilities. We make up 15% of the world's population, 1.2 billion people. So it's really hard to understand that. So, but what does that mean in intersection with the Black community? What does it mean with the LGBTQIA community and being a woman? And the conversations shifted so much, I think, as an athlete. And I think I don't think we see the impacts now, but I think from a grassroots movement and like who's going to enter athletics moving forward, especially the next generation, around mental health, social justice, it's just never going to be the same in the best possible way.
Thank you, Anna, and I appreciate your transparency. I think I can speak for everyone on that. Ron, from your vantage point, you got a unique set of circumstances down at Morehouse, but then even zooming out from your personal vantage point, your personal perspective as a former practitioner now in academia, having seen it from a macro and a micro level, what are your thoughts on how the ongoing pandemic and social justice movements that continue to ebb and flow impact our athletes, their mental wellness?
Well, I just wanted to talk about an interesting thing that happened this weekend, because I teach a sports reporting class, and I've been teaching them how to cover football. So they've done some games written some game stories off of TV, but I took them to the Morehouse homecoming football game on Saturday, and that was their first time to really be a reporter, at a live event. So Morehouse had started the season 0-5. And then they, surprisingly upset Tuskegee, their big rival, 2 weeks ago. And then they had this home game against Fort Valley State, which is, a traditional rival for us. And our field is being renovated, so we're actually playing at Clark Atlanta's field. And Morehouse came out, and we were ahead 44-0 before halftime, and won the game 51-3. And that was just remarkable. So I had my students got a chance to interview the coach and a player afterwards. And I was asking the player what turned it around. And he said, well, during the pandemic, everybody went home. It's a small school. So he said, we couldn't work out. We didn't have weights. I don't know what an Ohio State does for its players in that situation, but Morehouse is just a small operation. And so he said, when we came back, we were sort of out of shape. Coach was very conscious of getting us back into condition. And then they have this odd schedule where they don't have a bye this year, I think. And so they sort of wore themselves out trying to get into playing shape. And once the coaches realized that, they decided to give everybody like 2 days off after a game instead of 1 day. And once they started doing that, the team bounced back. So then with 2 days off, they beat Tuskegee. And then with 2 days off again, they demolished Fort Valley State. And so part of it is this physical reaction. Another thing is, when you miss a year and a half, your juniors and seniors, they're gone. So they said when the players got together this year, a lot of them, they'd never met each other. They didn't know each other. And so we were talking about building team chemistry. It was very difficult to build team chemistry when players hadn't seen each other for, at least one season and maybe two, depending on their sport. So that was another thing. So it took them to 5 games to pull together the physical conditioning, the skills, and the team chemistry. And now they're ready to roll. So their coach, his name is Rich Freeman, and I think it's a very, very good coach. And what he talked about is Well, we have two halves to our season. Our first half, we went 0-5, but now we're 2-0. So that's the approach the players are taking. And now, and at 2-0, we have a chance to make the playoffs. So again, and this brings up another thing, which is for athletes, how good is their coach at turning a negative situation into a positive situation? And how good is their coach in pulling together a team after their routine for probably since they've been like in third grade has been broken. So I think part of it has to do with how good is your coach at dealing with these things, both physical and psychological. And you
bring up so many fantastic points, and that's a great, fantastic perspective. But even that latter point that you mentioned, I wasn't even thinking about, but I'm going to bring it up throughout the conversation. Even in terms of our support structure as athletes, and specifically student athletes, their relative capability and being equipped to support, because as I'm going to serve it up for Dr. Coakley to explain a little bit more about what she does and the prevalence of her role on various campuses. Oftentimes, and I'm a former student athlete at San Jose State myself, oftentimes our coaches are the ones that we go to the most, who oftentimes are the least equipped to take us through this. And we didn't have a Dr. Coakley at all. So we leaned on them for a lot more than what was in their job description. And I see the Amen corner giving me head nods, because I think we can all relate to all of that. So you bring up a tremendous point that we are absolutely going to come back to. But Dr. Coakley, let's stay there in terms of the support structure. You have a unique role, and unfortunately it is unique. I wish it was common. But you're the Senior Associate Athletic Director for Mental Health, Wellness, and Performance there at Temple University. And it says in your bio that you were the first full-time mental health specialist at Temple within athletics. First of all, can you describe your role? Because we're going to unpack it. Describe your role, where you sit within the ecosystem of athletics, but then also, is this a prevalent role that we see on other campuses? And how do we move towards normalizing that and embedding it?
Okay, that's a lot. So my role, I do a lot of things, everybody. Well, let me start. So as a senior associate AD, I sit on our senior leadership. So I'm also an administrator, but also a clinician. So I wear those two hats, which are pretty heavy. If you think about an administrator standing up a program, wanting to be able to provide mental health and wellness services, not just to the student athletes, while they are my priority, everybody's got mental health. Forget about the coaches, can't forget about the academic advisors, can't forget about the rest of the people in the ecosystem, right? Everybody needs this kind of resource. While I can't be the resource for them, I could point them to resources. So trying to establish a program is one role, and then being a clinician is another. I will speak to my clinician role because, in the general population, they say 1 in 5 people will experience a mental health challenge in a year. I think that number has increased in the last 2 years. I'm going to go to maybe 33%, at least a third of us will need something this year more than a vacation or a nap. And so I provide mental health services for student athletes primarily, but I have about 550 or so student athletes. So that's only going to cover about 120, 150 of them if I'm, exceeding my expectations. So what about the other ones? Does their mental health not matter? I mentioned earlier, I am a very proactive person. Just because somebody's not struggling this year doesn't mean, junior year, they won't be struggling. So I want to be able to arm the remainder of the student athletes who this year may not be struggling like some of their peers with some tools so that they are equipped for junior year when that thing happens, whether they get an injury or they have a death in their family or they, I don't know, some other trauma, get into an accident. So that they have some tools on board so that adversity, that challenge doesn't completely shake them up, shake them to their core, and cause them to experience, symptoms, either mental, emotional, or physical, right? Our physical symptoms are sometimes indicative of mental well-being. One of those, the first ones to go is our sleep. So when people's sleep starts getting jacked up for weeks on end, that is usually a sign to me that something else is there. So we provide mental health services, but we provide wellness services as well to try to stave off some of the future challenges that some folks they're going to experience. And then lastly, which happens to be one of my favorite things to do because it's more strength-based, it is the sport performance. So how to have more confidence, how to be more motivated, how to do all the things that you came to Temple to do, which is exceed your expectations or shatter them even. So we do three things there. I have set up a program that I think is pretty holistic. We have, like I said, we have something for everybody. So for the student athletes who are not getting the clinical mental health services, we have things like Headspace, which is a meditation app that all student athletes have access to. I implemented that in the beginning of the 2019 academic year, so just before the pandemic. And I'm grateful that I was able to put that in place because they had a resource prior to the big thing that we didn't know was coming our way, that they were already learning techniques to manage their stress and anxiety and to get good sleep and to learn how to focus better and, block out distractions. So some of them, not all of them, but they all had access to it. And some of them were truly taking advantage of it, which I think was helpful because I could just say when the pandemic hit, Headspace, do a Headspace meditation. And one of the things that I did during that whole period, we sent out every month, I think, we sent out like some kind of a communication about like, these are some things that you might be experiencing. Here are some strategies and tips that you may try. If that doesn't work, please, we're here. Here's the referral link. So we have a referral program. Anybody in our athletic department can refer somebody. So,
Dr. Coakley, sorry to interrupt, but I think you're sparking some thoughts amongst our panelists. Mark, you got your hand up. Jump in.
Yeah, this is for Dr. Coakley because this is something I think that is confusing because when I think back to my piddly college basketball career, the people that brought me the most mental strain were my coaches. At the four schools that I went to. So my question to you, because this has always been confusing, is I think the thing that's tough with a lot of athletes is you're so young. You're 18, 19, 20, 21. You're becoming an adult. And I was always taught that, adults are authority figures and coaches and athletic directors and everything. Like you got to treat them with respect. So if an athlete comes to you and they're telling you that this coach is doing things that is demeaning to them, I mean, I hate to bring back a past, but there was the coach actually I loved at San Jose State who basically lost his job 30 years ago because he was too hard on the players and they took a stand. But if an athlete is telling you, hey, this coach is too mean or this coach crossed the line in other ways, I've wondered with the people like yourself who are working for the teams, like, what do you do? Because these conversations are supposed to be private, but if a coach or an executive or somebody on the staff is crossing a line, whether it's mental, physical, what can you sound an alarm, or do you have to keep it private?
Yes. We can communicate that information to those who need to. So at my institution, we have a reporting system. It's anonymous. It's called Real Recruit, I think. And student athletes have access to that. They could pop that in at any moment. But let's just say they tell me. The first thing that I'm going to do is listen and allow them to just get that out. Because remember, I talked about how things, when we suppress them, cause issues with something in us. So just for them being able to speak that out loud is helpful and a first step. And then something else that I do with our coaches, because you can't like we're all a part of the ecosystem. So every month I do training with our coaches on mental health, some mental health topic. We just did psychological safety on Tuesday. So we had a whole hour-long training, if you will, where coaches were very vulnerable and talking about things that matter to them. But we're trying to impress upon them that Mr. Thomas, you just said it. Dr. Thomas, you just said it. These folks don't know each other. For 2 years, we have students who don't have a connection to each other, yet you want them to go out and like do all this stuff. And people aren't like thinking about that. So I'm the person who thinks about that stuff. And then I tell coaches like, it's important for you to be aware of that the way that teams organically develop that cohesion. We haven't had that for 2 years. Let's just call it 2 years. The last time these kids competed, the juniors were freshmen. And some of them may not have competed that year, or the season was taken away from them. And so I do this training with coaches just to help them to understand like certain things, like that might work, yelling at, half your team might work. But do you just want to be able to communicate to half of your team, or do you want to be able to communicate to the whole team? All right, so let's try to figure out another strategy, because you are working at cross purposes to what your ultimate goal is by yelling at the whole team, if that's not going to work. So the training I do is designed to help them to hear that in a way that they can receive it without being too defensive. Because honestly, I just heard a student athlete say something the other day about a coach. And I was like, okay, say more about that. And I took it up the chain, because I don't have to say who said it. Right. So nobody knows who's coming to see us. And so I just communicate that information, especially before it gets to, because it wasn't harmful per se, but it was troubling because I've heard it more than once. And so, I just shoot it up the chain, and we had a conversation about it with somebody up the chain. And we talked about it in that training. Those trainings, all coaches don't attend because seasons and schedules, but we record them. And so they're always there where they can have access to them.
Dr. Coakley, I think you're stoking more thoughts. I'm going to bring Anna, and she has her hand up. And please do let us know when we move towards billable hour territory. You can invoice Dr. Akilah Carter-Francique for all of this time. But this is fantastic, Anna.
As an athlete, yeah, I might bill you, for your time for sure. No, I just wanted to add to that and the importance, and just kind of reiterate, especially from the athlete side of what you're saying. So I just wanted to props, and if you see me do this is the sign language cheer. So
nice.
It's I'm not being like super weird like Jess. But no, I think with athletes, I think it's important to teach coaches that, because we are disposable. That's kind of how we feel as an athlete. And, people go to colleges because of the coach, or move to training facilities because of the coach. So you are just, a product to them. And so I'm learning that from a coaching side, and having those, and to your point, Mark, having a space to be, when you voice something, it's not just white noise of like, oh, this, glad you shared your opinions, right? It's having actionable items of, still now women will bring up sexual abuse, and it is just under the rug because it can't be talked about. And because it's a hard conversation, and it's starting to get better. But I think the importance of what your work, Dr. Coakley, is so relevant for mental health too, because athletes will be like, my mom was diagnosed with cancer while I was training, and I just swam through that, and I said I was having a hard day, and it's like, okay, well, just swim it out, just get it out of your body. Like that was going to fix it. So having an actionable item behind when an athlete comes to you is just so important. So I apologize for interrupting. I just wanted to add on from an athlete side, and it looks like Ron is also excited to jump in as well.
This is fantastic. Ron, chime in. Oh, Ron, you're on mute.
Okay.
There you go.
I want to introduce a new topic here. And I guess partly it's because certainly my experience as a sports reporter, but also one of our missions in our program, it was started by Spike Lee and Ralph Wiley, former ESPN writer. So one of our primary missions is developing more Black sports reporters. And, you know, a lot of the things that we were talking about apply to sports journalists too. And nobody ever talks about us. Nobody ever, basically nobody cares. And I was really glad to hear that Mark seemed to, that people were sort of conscious of the sports journalists and taking care of them, and he was smart enough to take care of himself. But, you know, one of the problems that athletes have is it's very hard to keep a marriage together or a relationship together if you play, let's say, on a baseball team, and if it's a 9-month season, plus you got spring training, and you're on the road half of the time. Well, the writer who covers that team is also on the road for 81 to cover 81 road games out of 162 game baseball season. A basketball writer, you know, it was a 9-month season. You're gone half the time. And then you get this, at my time, you'd get this huge block off, like 6 weeks off during the summer, but then the season hits again. And your life and your family's life is determined by the schedule of the team. That, you know, and so that causes a lot of family tension. In fact, years ago when I was really young, and I don't remember how this came up, but my sports editor said, Ron, if you ever want to get married, don't bother to buy a ring. There are so many unused wedding rings here in this department because these guys have covered baseball and basketball and they end up getting divorced. So no one thinks about, you know, the reporters. Also, when we were talking about social media effect, when I was writing, you know, the public's response to you came in the form of letters to the editor. And we printed our letters to the editor maybe once a week on Friday. And, you know, very seldom did you get letters. And most of them were critical, but, you know, nothing super harsh. And there weren't very many of them. So, but the one time I did get...
Hey, Ron, and they published your name.
Yes, that's true. That's true. You could
Right,
not
so
be...
you can't just write something and just, you know, I'm X42813 James, you know what I mean?
Right. And then your phone number was in the phone book, and I could pick up the phone and call you if I wanted to. You didn't have cell phones that popular at that time. So, but then also, the one time I got a lot of negative letters was when, it's a short story, I covered Larry Bird, the Bird Magic final, NBA final. I've been writing for several years for the Chronicle covering college basketball. Nobody knew I was Black because even if I wrote a column, which was rarely, but if I did, the Chronicle's policy was that it did not publish the photos of the columnists. But it turned out that in writing a story about the fact that Larry Bird refused to speak to the press after they lost the game to Michigan State, the final of Michigan State, I also wrote a little segment about what it was like to be Black in Provo, Utah, because that was where one of the regional finals was held. And suddenly my readers knew that I was a Black guy and then, you know, criticizing Larry Bird. And I got at least, I'd say 20 to 30 negative letters because of that. And I still have them. So I point that out because now when you write a story, you can get an onslaught of these negative, harsh, vicious, sometimes comments from people, which writers never had to deal with before. We sort of lived in our own bubble and just ignored the fans, basically. So, you know, I think that it would be good. I don't know who in the world would do it, but it would be good for someone to pay attention to sports journalists and what their lifestyle is like in doing their job. And I tell my students now, like, even for the Saturday football game, one of the students wanted extra credit for covering the game. And I was like, what? And he said, well, you know, this is a Monday, Wednesday class. You're asking us to work on Saturday. And I just laughed him off. But the fact is that it's a weird life. And I tell my students, look, if you want to have a 9-to-5 life, then don't be a sports journalist. Maybe be a copy editor, you know, but don't, because you're not going to be able to tolerate it. And I told them, marry the right person, because you're going to have to marry someone who, to a degree, maybe is at least half the time is going to be willing to be a single parent, even though they're married. Because if you cover baseball or basketball, you're going to be on the road half the time. So sports journalists are under a lot of these similar pressures, but nobody cares to a degree. I mean, really. And then the other thing is, at least an athlete can leave their profession rich if they're in the right profession. Let me tell you, a sports journalist does not leave rich, at least the print journalist. Maybe if you get on TV and you get to be Stephen A. or Michael Wilbon, yes. But so we don't get that financial benefit at the end either. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Ron, let's pivot a little bit and let's move over to the media side of this, because I wanted to go there as well. And you provided a fantastic transition to that. Ron, you wrote a book chapter back in the 90s entitled "Blacks Are Still Rare in the Press Box." And it discussed the relative lack of much of what you were just talking about, the relative lack of Black sports reporters, which is still a problem that persists to this day, of course. I'm sure Mark agrees with that as well. But I'll also add the lack of Black news editors and general leadership as well, pushing the charge. Couple of questions revolving around that, one of which we'll touch on and expand upon a bit more of what you just laid out. But first, from the standpoint of Black athletes and athletes of color, how do you think the lack of representation in media amongst journalists, amongst leaders within journalists, editors, and the like, how do you think that impacts how Black athletes are portrayed in the media in general, but also as it relates to their activism? Is there a correlation?
Well, in general, everybody raised, let's say, in this country, certainly is raised and affected by the stereotypes, where they have to do with race or gender, sexual orientation. There are just a lot of stereotypes that float around, and it affects all of us in some way. Yeah. And I think, when we're talking about lack of Black sports editors, probably the number is half a dozen. Mark, am I right? Maybe half a dozen Black sports editors among the 1,200 newspapers in the country. So,
and most of them work at ESPN.
Well, yeah. So because of that, there certainly is a degree of lack of sensitivity in general among sports editors because they're not minorities. And so I think it probably has certainly some effect on stories that get written. I know, from time to time I've heard Black reporters say, I wanted to write this and my sports editor didn't go for it. So I think sometimes it limits what Black reporters are able to produce. But the other thing is, I think there's a responsibility for white sports editors and white reporters to have a sensitivity to the concerns of Black athletes and non-white performers. Mm-hmm. And I guess they have to develop it. I guess one of the questions I would have is that taught in journalism schools? And is that taught in the sports, in the journalism programs that have an emphasis on sports? I don't know the answer to that. But Arizona State, Syracuse, Northwestern, they all have a sports journalism focus within their graduate programs. I don't know if that's taught. And I think it is important that they were to talk about racism in sports and the history of racism in sports, because that would inform some of the types of stories they write. So I'm giving a sort of scattered answer here, but I don't think there's any way in the society that and with the prevalence of race as an aspect of society, I don't think when you only have about 5 Black sports editors in the country, and I'm talking really newspapers here when I say that number, that you can say that what's produced that the content that the public sees is not affected by that.
I would like to say I have a lot more optimism now about people of color, women, the LGBTQIA community than I ever had before. The San Francisco Chronicle has a new sports editor. from the LGBTQIA community, which was a phenomenal hire. Somebody used to work at ESPN. My boss at the Undefeated is a Black woman, who's very, very powerful, by the name of Raina Kelly. My sports editor is a Black woman. I think I kind of tell people, Dr. Shaun, you were a Boomerang fan? Movie?
Of course. Of course.
I say working at the Undefeated at ESPN is like working at like Lady Eloise. Remember Lady Eloise? Like when they walked into the office and with nothing but Black folks in there, like I'm like in fairy tale land, like working at the Undefeated, where most of the people there, we probably got more women than any other department in ESPN. Definitely more Black people, more like we just hired. Well, I shouldn't be saying this because I didn't have that. My previous main editor, my last three were a Black woman, Lisa Wilson, who's now the NFL editor at Athletic, Matthew Wong, Chinese, who just left the Sports Illustrated, and I'm hearing we're hiring somebody who's Mexican American. So we are like, I guess, the model of diversity at the Undefeated, but I know that's certainly not the case, especially when, you know, you move into the ESPN side, or when I worked at Yahoo, and I was not only the only person, I was the only person of color. There was no women on the staff when I worked at Yahoo Sports. That has since changed in terms of the writers, but we're seeing some strides now that I certainly haven't seen before in terms of, you know, diversity and getting opportunities. And, you know, I like to give kudos to the National Association of Black Journalists Sports Task Force, which Ron and I have both been chairs of, you know, the Hispanic group, awesome, the women's group, Asian journalist group. Like we've really, really been pushing to get more people of color, more women, you know, involved in these positions. And I think, I hate to say it, that maybe George Floyd's murder sparked some things. But now I'm finally seeing real change, finally having optimism.
You know, I want to add to what Mark's saying, particularly about the George Floyd effect, because I've been at Morehouse for 15 years, and our program started from scratch. So it started with no students. So certainly there wasn't even any reason for a graduate school to be coming to my program, you know, talking to my students. But now we've been here 15 years. And in the last year, I have never received as many offers for internships as before. A lot of companies now, media outlets, are targeting HBCUs and trying to make sure that they extend at least the offer of an internship and inform the head of the program about internship opportunities. So I've gotten many more of those. I think graduate schools are paying more attention to HBCUs and trying to recruit HBCU students. There are some programs that have started, particularly trying to get more Blacks and minorities into athletics. There's one called from the John Mcclendon Foundation. It's called the John Mcclendon Minority Leadership Institute. And what they've done is they've partnered with a lot of schools. And this was started by John Calipari and Tommy at Kentucky and Tommy Amaker at Harvard. And they are giving students minority students an opportunity to work for a year. It's a 10-month appointment, pays about $25,000 to $30,000, and you get to work in an athletic department. And the idea is that after that year, you should have enough experience to be able to get a job, probably at another school in athletic administration. And the hope is that eventually we will increase the numbers of Black athletic directors. So there are more opportunities. And also on the journalism side, the Associated Press sports editors has reached out to HBCUs, encouraging their students to join their mentoring programs. So the and the National Football Writers Association and also the U.S. Basketball Writers Association have started mentoring programs. And I know directly contacted me to encourage my students to apply to be mentees. So all of those things have happened since George Floyd's murder. And again, I often think about his daughter saying that her dad is going to change the world. And what has happened in sports in the last year in this way is actually telling us that she's right.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful sentiment.
And could I say something real quick?
Go ahead, Mark. Go ahead, Mark. And then
and one thing, and maybe this is my own like little campaign, and Ron's the elder statesman. Like I grew up on Ron. Like I followed Ron and studied Ron and people of his. So my love to Ron. He knows that. I hate the word minority, man, and especially as a journalist, as a Black man. I really wish we could get rid of it in writing. I ain't nobody minority. I ain't less than nobody. And there will be a time when the minority will be the majority, but I don't care when that day comes. I won't write that word. I'm not, I just get off this soapbox, but I really hate that word. Like every time somebody calls people of color a minority, to me, it's just as offensive as the N-word to me. And I know I'm maybe being overly dramatic, but you know, words matter, and I know what the definition of that word is. And so I don't use that in my writing. I don't use that in my speech. And I don't think I'm gonna change the world, but I feel like that word is powerful, and I just don't use it.
So Mark,
and quick note, we have about 6 minutes. So I want to make sure we get it in.
What's
Go
that?
Ahead. Go ahead, Ron.
I just wanted to say, what would you prefer to be said?
People of color. That's what I use in my writing. I know it's maybe longer, but I said it. I'll get off. Go ahead, Doc.
I appreciate that. Words do matter. Words do matter. I appreciate that. Anna, you wanted to say something for a bit, and then I'm going to wrap things up with sort of a closing question, so we can then move to our audience break that we're going to give them. Anna, you want to say something? Go ahead.
No, I apologize and thank you. I know we're pretty much at time here. I was just saying, kind of to your original question about the power of representation in mental health, I think is so important. I work in marketing now, and I'm constantly beating the, DE&I drum, if you will, especially when it comes to disability in sport. People with disabilities, I mean, we haven't really mentioned it, right? And while we're talking about all of this, it's, we just got pay equity for the games. We just started getting paid the same for medals just this year for Tokyo 2021. And I think the power of representation through journalists, right? Making sure we're using the right language, right, Mark? And not saying differently abled, right? Saying people with disabilities or LGBTQIA, and making sure every letter is within that. I think the power of having the right people, the people in the communities, talk about their own mental health and represent their communities, knowing that none of us have the same experience, right? I think is so important. So I just wanted to build off of what everyone, the empowering words that everyone was saying. And I think, like I was saying, kind of with TikTok, knowing someone else out there has your back or has the same experience as you really empowers and uplifts, right? I think, like I said, we've kind of all unsiloed ourselves in our thinking because there are Latina, disabled, trans women out there, right? And making sure that we're talking for all of those experiences. So I just wanted to build off of the conversation, and thank you for the space, and I will let you get back to it.
Of course, and thank you, Anna, and we're going to hear from you in a second again, because I want to throw out our sort of capstone question to everyone as we close out, and I'll ask that we keep it to about a minute or so. But as a culminating question, I want you to be thinking about how we started, talking about where we are, the state of the state, from your vantage points in terms of the greatest opportunity that we have to move this conversation forward in an earnest way, not just in words, but in action. So we see more individuals like Dr. Coakley. We see more resources allocated. We see more people talking in journalism like Mark and Ron. We see more people in academia talking about it like myself and Ron and Stephany. We see more people on the international level like Anna talking about it on various levels. We see more representation. We see all of that. Dr. Coakley, to start with you, what would you say is the biggest opportunity that we should look towards in sort of our investment in?
I think I mentioned it earlier. When we get to the place where mental health and health are synonymous, and the same way Dr. Fletcher, Mark Spears, Ron Thomas, and Anna, you all go to your doctor once a year for a wellness check, that we're doing that with a therapist, a clinician, a social worker, and we're going in to just get a little tune-up, see what's going on. How's your sleep? Anything worrying you? Any grief and loss issues happening for you? And then put a plan into place so that that insomnia, that grief and loss issue, that trauma that you might have experienced doesn't get worse, for lack of a better word, so that you're not needing higher levels of care. And to those, when people need higher levels of care, then the other parts of their lives start to kind of slowly erode. So their relationships, their job, their performance, like these other parts of them, and then the other part would be is that we treat our athletes as whole people. I just said, you're not a product, you're not an object, you're a human with a mind and a body both are of equal importance. And so those would be my two opportunities, whole and health and mental health being synonymous.
Thank you so much. Anna, same question to you. How do we move this forward? What's an area of opportunity you would point to?
Dr. Coakley, I think you stole it and said it perfectly, but no, I think treating people as people, right? And that means for journalists, for athletes, for academics, there's going to be someone knocking on my door again, but treating people as people, employees as people we've seen. And, right, there's so many employees just, whether it's frontline or behind a computer at home, making sure that you're taking care of people holistically and bringing all parts and creating that psychological safety. And making sure everyone can bring their whole selves to where they are across the board. I think that's a huge opportunity for us.
Mark and then Ron.
Well, I think a lot of times my generation beats up on the younger generation and why they do this and why they do that, and they don't get it. But one thing I'll give them big credit for is pushing the mental health importance forward, I do think that my generation and older, like we just won't do it, aren't comfortable doing it, and probably don't even like. It's interesting, Dr. Coakley. I'm like, when you said that, like I don't really even know how to go forward to find somebody to talk to, and I definitely need that. We all need that, and so in the youth. And in their strength to say, hey, I need help, I think they're inspiring their uncles, their aunts, their parents, their cousins, to their older cousins, their grandmothers, like grandfathers, to do something that they probably weren't comfortable doing before. And it's not just athletes, that this is the younger generation in general who I think they're being very inspirational and maybe getting people to get outside of their box.
And Ron, your thoughts?
I think from a journalist standpoint, one of the things we need to do is do a better job of relationship building with the people we cover. When I talk to my students, I talk about the importance of, when you're interviewing somebody, look for something you have in common with them. It maybe you're from the same area, maybe you have the same hobby, something that maybe you notice a book that they're reading that you're also reading. Just something that you have in common with the athletes you cover is a really good thing. And I think it's really important that they also try to get to know players as individuals and think of them as individuals. Sometimes in the media, we can be sort of cynical about the people we cover, but it is important to realize that players have different personalities, different feelings, different sensitivities. And I think the better job we do getting in tune with that. Also will help our relationship with the players, which will get us better interviews and better stories. And you'll just have create a more positive environment in your job. So I think that would really be helpful for journalists to be conscious of those types of things.
Ron, Anna, Mark, Dr. Coakley, thank you so very much for joining us. Thank you so very much for giving of yourselves in such a transparent way over this last near 90 minutes that we have had. It has been heart-filling for myself and affirming. I can speak for many, I'm pretty sure. So again, thank you for the work that you continue to do. Thank you for waging this and continuing to carry this on the different fronts that each of you all continue to participate in an earnest way. So we appreciate you. We wish you well as you move forward in the work that you do. And again, I will end this like I started it by those who are listening as well. Even as you move away from this session, continuing to be mindful and practicing self-care, which again, as Mark mentioned, we all need. All right. So with that being said, thank you again. I am going to turn it over to Dr. Carter Francique, who is going to send us to a bit of a break.
Oh my gosh, what an amazing power-packed panel. Dr. Fletcher and the mic, thank you so much for your leadership, your moderation, and facilitating this great conversation, this thoughtful conversation with regards to the media and mental health.